She stood alone in the marble hallway outside Courtroom 7, her worn purse clutched against her chest like armor, facing the man who once called her family, now her accuser. But Vincent Ashford had forgotten one thing: his twin boys loved her more than they feared him. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. She stood alone in the marble hallway outside Courtroom 7, her worn purse clutched against her chest like armor, facing the man who once called her family, now her accuser. But Vincent Ashford had forgotten one thing: his twin boys loved her more than they feared him. The morning light filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows that seemed to divide the world into stark contrasts, much like the chasm that had opened between Amara and the family she'd served with unwavering devotion for 3 years. Her reflection stared back from the polished floor, a 32-year-old black woman in her only good dress, navy blue with careful mends at the seams, her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked professional, dignified, and utterly alone. Across the city, Vincent Ashford stood in his corner office on the 40th floor, staring down at the ant-like people below. At 38, he commanded a business empire worth billions, yet this morning he felt the weight of something far heavier than money, the crushing responsibility of being right when his heart whispered he might be terribly wrong. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man carved from expensive suits and bitter experience. Dark hair touched with silver at the temples, jaw set in permanent resolve, eyes the color of winter storms. Those same eyes had once looked at Amara with something approaching warmth, before everything changed. "Sir." His assistant's voice cut through his thoughts. "The car is ready." Vincent nodded without turning. On his desk lay the legal brief, 40 pages of accusations that would destroy the woman his sons called their angel. Theft. Breach of trust. Violation of employment contract. The words felt foreign on his tongue, like speaking a language that didn't belong to him. But the evidence was there. The missing jewelry. The unexplained deposits in her account. The timing, just days after he'd let his guard down and almost. He stopped that thought before it could fully form. Back at the courthouse, Amara checked the time on her phone, the same device that Vincent's lawyers claimed she'd used to photograph his safe combination. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the messages of support from her church family, her sister in Atlanta, her elderly neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd offered to sell her own wedding ring to help pay for a lawyer. "You don't need their lawyers, baby girl," her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "You got something more powerful, the truth and the good Lord's eyes on you." The truth. Such a simple concept, yet here she was, about to enter a courtroom where her truth would battle against Vincent's money, his connections, his army of legal experts. Where her word as a black domestic worker would stand against the testimony of a man who owned half the city's skyline. A soft chime echoed through the hallway, the signal for court to begin. Amara straightened her shoulders and whispered a prayer her grandmother had taught her: "Lord, let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream." She didn't see the two small figures pressed against the window of the courthouse's upper floor, their identical faces streaked with tears. 8-year-old boys who should have been in their private school classroom, but instead had convinced their driver to bring them here with a story about a forgotten lunchbox and a desperate need to see their father. Mason and Michael Ashford watched their beloved Amara walk toward the courtroom doors, and their young hearts broke with an understanding beyond their years. The woman who'd sung them to sleep, who'd kissed their scraped knees, who'd held them during thunderstorms when their father was away on business, that woman was in trouble. And their daddy, the man they loved and feared in equal measure, was the one putting her there. "We have to help her, Mickey," Mason whispered to his brother, using the nickname only he was allowed to say. Michael nodded, his jaw set with a determination that mirrored his father's. "Mama always said angels watch over people who love kids. Maybe we can be Amara's angels today." Neither boy understood the complex adult world of accusations and legal proceedings, but they understood love. They understood loyalty. And they understood that sometimes, when grown-ups get everything wrong, it takes children to make it right. Vincent's black Mercedes pulled up to the courthouse just as Amara disappeared inside. He sat for a moment, gathering himself, preparing for what his lawyers called a straightforward case. But nothing about this felt straightforward. Nothing about watching the woman who'd brought laughter back into his house, who'd made his boys smile again after their mother's death, stand accused felt right. Yet the evidence. He stepped out of the car, his expensive shoes clicking against the courthouse steps with the rhythm of a funeral march. Today would end it. Today would prove he'd been right to keep his heart locked away, right to trust no one with his children's welfare, right to build walls so high that no one could climb them and cause the kind of pain that Mr. Ashford. He turned to see a young reporter, camera already rolling. Any comment on today's proceedings? Do you really believe your children's nanny is guilty of? Vincent's security detail stepped forward, but he held up a hand. For just a moment, he considered the question. Did he believe it? Really, truly believe that the woman who'd cried during their first Christmas together because the boys had given her a family would steal from them? Justice will speak for itself, he said finally, the words tasting like ash. Inside the courthouse, Amara had taken her seat at the defendant's table. The public defender assigned to her case looked younger than her purse and had already apologized twice for not having more time to prepare. Across the aisle, Vincent's legal team arranged their materials with military precision. 5 lawyers in suits that cost more than Amara made in 6 months. The bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Patricia Hawkins entered, a black woman in her 60s whose reputation for fairness was legendary, whose own journey from poverty to the bench was well known. If there was any hope for justice today, it lived in those wise, tired eyes. Be seated, Judge Hawkins said, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent navigating the intersection of law and humanity. We're here today in the matter of Ashford versus Jolie. Accusations of theft and breach of trust. Counselor Morrison, you may begin. Vincent's lead attorney stood, his silver hair and commanding presence designed to intimidate. But as he began laying out the case against Amara, his words seemed to echo from a great distance. Because Vincent had just noticed something that made his blood turn to ice water. 2 small faces pressed against the courtroom's gallery window. His sons. Here. Watching their father destroy the woman they loved. What do you think? Have you ever had to choose between protecting your heart and fighting for what's right? Share your thoughts below. The courtroom felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls had moved closer while Vincent stared at his sons' faces in the gallery window. Mason and Michael pressed their small hands against the glass like prisoners watching their world collapse, their identical expressions of heartbreak cutting through him sharper than any legal brief ever could. Attorney Morrison's voice droned on, painting Amara as a calculating thief who'd exploited a grieving widower's trust. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defendant used her position of intimate access to systematically rob the Ashford family. She photographed safe combinations, copied security codes, and exploited the vulnerability of 2 motherless children too. Objection. The public defender's voice cracked slightly. Speculation without evidence. Sustained, Judge Hawkins said, but her eyes had found the same window Vincent was staring at. A slight frown creased her brow. Amara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but Vincent could see the slight tremor in her shoulders. She'd always done that when she was trying not to cry. He'd learned to recognize it during those first difficult months after his wife's death, when grief hung over the house like a shroud and his boys barely spoke above whispers. Morrison continued his opening statement, producing blown-up photographs of Amara's bank statements, pointing to deposits that coincided with missing jewelry. Vincent had seen this evidence a dozen times, had convinced himself it was conclusive. But watching Amara's face, the genuine confusion, the hurt so raw it seemed to bleed into the courtroom air, doubt crept in like poison. The defendant will claim she was treated like family, Morrison said, his voice dripping with disdain. That she loved these children. But love doesn't steal from innocent boys. Love doesn't betray the trust of a man still grieving his wife's death. Love doesn't. The courtroom doors burst open with a sound like thunder. That's not true. Every head turned as 8-year-old Mason Ashford ran down the center aisle, his school uniform rumpled, his face streaked with tears and fierce determination. Behind him, Michael followed, moving with the same desperate urgency. Boys, no. Vincent half rose from his seat, but Judge Hawkins' gavel cracked like a whip. Order. Bailiff, please. She didn't steal anything. Mason had reached the front of the courtroom, his small voice carrying with surprising strength. Amara would never steal from us. She loves us. She's our real mommy now. Michael added, his voice breaking on the words that hit Vincent like a physical blow. The courtroom erupted. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. The jury leaned forward. Vincent's lawyers looked like they'd been struck by lightning. But Amara had gone perfectly still, tears flowing silently down her cheeks as she looked at these 2 boys who just called her their mother. Mason, Michael. Vincent's voice cut through the chaos as he moved toward his sons. You shouldn't be here. This is adult business. No, Daddy. Mason stepped protectively in front of Amara's chair. You're being mean to our Amara. You're lying about her. She never took Mommy's jewelry, Michael said, his voice steadier now. We know where it is. We've always known. The courtroom went dead silent. Even Judge Hawkins leaned forward, her gavel forgotten. Vincent felt the earth shifting beneath his feet. What are you talking about? Mason wiped his nose with his sleeve, looking so young and vulnerable that several jury members visibly softened. We took Mommy's rings, Daddy, after she died. We wanted to keep them safe, so we buried them in the garden behind the rose bushes. Like pirates bury treasure. We were gonna give them back when we got older, Michael whispered. We just missed her so much, and they smelled like her perfume, and we thought maybe if we kept them close, she wouldn't really be gone. The silence stretched like a held breath. Vincent stared at his sons, these two perfect mirrors of his own face, and felt something fundamental crack inside his chest. The jewelry. The missing pieces that had started this whole nightmare. His boys had taken them, not to steal, but to hold on to the last fragments of their mother's presence. And the money in Amara's account, Mason continued, his words tumbling out in a rush now. That was from Daddy. We heard him on the phone telling Uncle James that he was going to give Amara extra money because she was so good to us after Mommy died. He said she deserved a bonus for being our guardian angel. Vincent's world tilted. The deposits. The evidence his lawyers had called conclusive proof of theft. Money he'd authorized as bonuses during those dark months when Amara had literally held his family together, staying late when he worked, sleeping in the guest room when the boys had nightmares, becoming the soft place they landed when grief made everything else sharp and dangerous. Money he'd forgotten about in his panic and pain when the jewelry went missing. Boys. His voice came out as barely a whisper. Amara finally spoke, her voice thick with tears but steady as bedrock. Vincent, I never took anything from you. I never could. These boys, she looked at Mason and Michael with such pure love that several jury members were now openly crying. They're the light of my life. They're why I stayed when you were so angry after Sarah's death. They're why I endured your coldness, your suspicion. Because they needed someone to love them unconditionally. We tried to tell you, Daddy, Michael said, moving to stand beside his brother in front of Amara. We tried to tell you that Amara makes us feel safe. That she sings us the same songs Mommy used to sing. That she knows exactly how we like our sandwiches cut and that Mason needs his stuffed elephant at night and that I'm afraid of the sound the heater makes. She remembers Mommy's birthday and helps us make cards for her in heaven, Mason added. She never tried to replace Mommy. She just loved us when you were too sad to remember how. Vincent felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling like sand castles before a tide. Every assumption he'd made, every piece of evidence he'd clung to, every moment of cold suspicion, it all collapsed under the weight of his children's simple, devastating truth. Amara loved them. Had always loved them. And he, God help him, he'd fallen in love with her too, somewhere in those quiet evenings when she'd read bedtime stories in voices that made his boys giggle, somewhere in those early mornings when he'd find her asleep in the nursery chair because one of them had been sick. He'd fallen in love with her kindness, her strength, her ability to bring light into rooms that had been dark for too long. And instead of admitting it, instead of facing the terrifying possibility of loving someone again and maybe losing them too, he'd convinced himself she was a threat. He'd turned love into suspicion, trust into accusation. He destroyed the best thing that had happened to his family since Sarah's death. Amara, he whispered, taking a step toward her. But she was looking at his sons now, her expression fierce with protective love. Mason, Michael, you need to go with your daddy now. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is, Mason said firmly. You're our family. Family fights for each other. Judge Hawkins cleared her throat, and the spell was broken. The courtroom remembered itself, the cameras, the lawyers, the formal proceedings that had been shattered by truth delivered from the mouths of babes. Mr. Morrison, she said quietly, in light of this testimony, how does your client wish to proceed? All eyes turned to Vincent. His lawyers were whispering urgently among themselves, but he couldn't hear them over the sound of his own heartbeat, over the echo of his son's words. She's our real mommy now. He looked at Amara, really looked at her for the first time in months. Saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the dignity in her posture, the way she held herself together even as his accusations had tried to tear her apart. Saw the woman who'd salvaged his family from grief and asked for nothing in return but the chance to love his children. The woman he'd repaid with suspicion and legal destruction. What would you do if you realized you'd accused the wrong person? That your fear had made you betray someone who only showed you love? Tell us in the comments below. The silence in the courtroom stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Vincent stood frozen between his legal team's urgent whispers and his son's expectant faces, caught in the devastating space between the man he'd been 5 minutes ago and the man he was being forced to become. Mr. Ashford. Judge Hawkins prompted, her voice cutting through his paralysis. Your response. But Vincent couldn't speak. The words lodged in his throat like broken glass. To admit he was wrong meant admitting he'd let fear corrupt his judgment. It meant acknowledging that his grief had turned him into exactly the kind of man Sarah had once gently teased him about becoming: cold, suspicious, unable to trust in goodness. Morrison leaned close, his voice a harsh whisper. Vincent, we can work with this. Children's testimony is unreliable. The deposits still look suspicious to an outsider. We can spin this as coaching, as don't. The word came out sharp enough to cut. Vincent's eyes never left Amara's face as she sat perfectly still, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Was it hope? Resignation? The careful blankness of someone who'd learned not to expect mercy from the powerful? Daddy. Mason's voice, small and uncertain now. Are you gonna say sorry to Amara? The question hit like a physical blow. Say sorry. As if 3 years of devotion followed by months of accusation and legal warfare could be erased with childhood simplicity. As if the woman sitting at that defendant's table, the woman who'd just watched his sons call her their mother in front of a room full of strangers, would even want his apology. Vincent's jaw tightened. This is more complicated than you understand, son. No, it's not. Michael stepped closer to his father, 8 years old and fearless in the way only children could be. You said she was bad. She's not bad. You are wrong. When we're wrong, we say sorry. When we're wrong, we say sorry. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, gentle but firm, teaching him the same lesson after one of their early fights. Before marriage had taught them both that some apologies carried weight too heavy for simple words. Amara finally moved, turning in her chair to face Vincent directly. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but he could hear the careful control underneath, like someone walking on ice, testing each step. Vincent. His name on her lips sounded different now. Not the warm way she used to say it when she'd bring him coffee in his study, not the careful formality of recent months. This was something new. Something careful and distant. I understand this is difficult. But your sons are watching. Whatever you decide about me, don't let them see their father as someone who can't admit a mistake. The words were perfectly chosen, diplomatic, even kind. But Vincent heard what she wasn't saying. I don't expect an apology. I don't expect anything from you anymore. Just don't damage your children in your refusal to see who I really am. That careful acceptance, that resigned protection of his sons even now, should have made everything easier. Instead, it made him furious. You think this is simple? The words came out harsher than he intended, and he saw several jury members flinch. You think because my boys love you, because they've concocted some story about missing jewelry, that everything is just forgiven. Amara's composure cracked, just slightly. Story. Children misremember things. They want to protect you, so they've created this narrative where. Vincent. Judge Hawkins' voice carried a warning. You might want to consider your next words carefully. But the dam had burst. Months of buried feelings, grief, attraction, terror at the thought of loving someone again only to lose them, shame at how easily he'd convinced himself she was a threat, all of it came pouring out as anger. 3 years, he said, his voice rising. 3 years you lived in my house, ate at my table, tucked my children into bed. And the whole time, you were what? Biding your time? Looking for opportunities. Mr. Ashford, Morrison tried to intervene, but Vincent was beyond legal strategy now. The boys say they took the jewelry, but how convenient that they've suddenly remembered this now. How convenient that their story explains everything away just when you need it most. Amara stood slowly, and something in her movement made the entire courtroom hold its breath. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. Convenient. She repeated the word like she was tasting something bitter. You think this is convenient for me, Vincent? Standing in this courtroom, listening to lawyers paint me as a thief while your sons, These beautiful boys I've loved like my own have to defend me from their own father. Her composure was fracturing now, and Vincent could see the real Amara underneath, the woman who'd held his family together, who'd absorbed his coldness and grief-fueled cruelty for months without breaking. You think it's convenient that I have to hear Mason call me his real mommy, while you stand there doubting whether he's even telling the truth? That I have to watch Michael try to protect me from the man he idolizes, while that same man looks at me like I'm, her voice broke. Like I'm nothing. Like these 3 years meant nothing. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling. That's not, Vincent started, but she cut him off. I loved your boys from the first day, Vincent. When Mason had nightmares about losing you too, when Michael started hoarding food in his room because he was afraid there wouldn't be enough. I loved them when they were angry at God for taking their mama, when they were angry at you for working so much, when they were angry at me for not being her. She wiped her eyes, but her voice grew stronger, not weaker. And I loved you. Even when you couldn't see past your grief to notice that your sons were healing. Even when you treated me like hired help one day and family the next, depending on your mood. Even when you decided I was a threat instead of admitting that maybe, just maybe, you felt something you weren't ready to feel. The words hit Vincent like physical blows. Because she was right. About all of it. The attraction he'd felt watching her read bedtime stories, the way his pulse quickened when she laughed at something the boys said, the terrifying moment when he'd realized she'd become essential not just to his children, but to him. The moment he decided she had to be dangerous, because the alternative, that she was exactly as good as she seemed, was too frightening to accept. Amara, he whispered, but she was shaking her head. No. You don't get to Amara me now. Not here. Not after this. She gestured to the courtroom, to the cameras, to the legal circus he'd created. You want to believe I'm a thief? Fine. Prove it. But don't you dare use your son's love for me as evidence of manipulation. Don't you dare turn their honesty into a conspiracy theory because it doesn't fit the story you need to believe about me. Mason was crying now, quiet tears that he wiped with his sleeve. Michael had wrapped his arms around his brother, and both boys looked smaller suddenly, fragile in a way that made Vincent's chest tighten with self-hatred. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, the words inadequate and too late. Amara looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something die in her eyes, some last flicker of hope he hadn't even realized was still there. But you did, she said simply. You did hurt me. And worse, you hurt them. They're going to remember this day, Vincent. They're going to remember that their father chose pride over truth, fear over love. That when it mattered most, you couldn't trust the woman who loved your family enough to let you destroy her rather than fight back. She turned to her overwhelmed public defender. I'd like to request a recess, Your Honor. I need a moment to speak with my counsel. Judge Hawkins nodded. 30-minute recess. Everyone remain in the building. As the courtroom began to empty, Vincent watched Amara gather her things with careful dignity. She knelt down to his son's level, and he couldn't hear what she said, but both boys nodded solemnly. Mason hugged her fiercely, and Michael whispered something that made her close her eyes and nod. Then she walked toward the door without looking back, leaving Vincent standing in the wreckage of his own making, finally understanding the difference between being right and being righteous, and realizing he'd chosen wrong. Daddy. Mason's voice was very small. Why are you being so mean to Amara? Vincent looked down at his sons, these perfect mirrors of his own stubbornness, and had no answer that wouldn't make him more of a monster than he already was. In the hallway, Amara leaned against the wall and let herself fall apart for exactly 60 seconds. Then she straightened her shoulders, dried her eyes, and began preparing for the fight of her life. Because Vincent Ashford might have forgotten who she was, but she hadn't forgotten who she'd chosen to become the day she first held his sons and promised them she'd never leave. Some promises, she realized, were stronger than the men who tried to break them. Have you ever been in a situation where pride kept you from admitting you were wrong, even when the truth was staring you in the face? How did it end? Share your experience below. The courthouse hallway buzzed with tension as people spilled from the courtroom, but Vincent barely noticed the chaos around him. His sons had disappeared, a realization that hit him like ice water as he scanned the crowd of reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers. Mason. Michael. His voice echoed off the marble walls, sharp with panic that had nothing to do with legal proceedings and everything to do with the look in his boys' eyes when they'd watched him tear apart the woman they loved. Mr. Ashford. His head of security appeared at his elbow, phone already in hand. The boys slipped past the bailiffs. Building security is checking. Find them. Vincent's command came out rougher than intended. Now. But even as his security team dispersed, Vincent knew with sick certainty where his sons had gone. The same instinct that had driven them to the courthouse in the first place would pull them toward the one person in this building who'd never failed to comfort them. He found them 3 floors down, in the small chapel the courthouse maintained for families seeking solace during difficult proceedings. The wooden pews sat mostly empty except for one, where Amara sat with her arms around both boys, their heads tucked against her shoulders like they were trying to burrow back into safety. Vincent stopped in the doorway, frozen by the sight. This was how he'd found them countless times over the past 3 years, after nightmares, after scraped knees, after the hard days when grief ambushed them all without warning. Amara, their steady anchor in every storm. The woman he'd just accused of manipulating their love. "We're not going back up there." Mason's voice was muffled against Amara's shoulder, but his determination rang clear. "We're not gonna watch Daddy be mean to you anymore. We can stay here forever," Michael added. "Like sanctuary. Bad people can't hurt you in church." Amara's laugh was soft and sad. "Oh, my sweet boys. It doesn't work that way." "It should," Mason said fiercely. "Daddy's being stupid. Grown-ups are supposed to be smart, but sometimes they're the stupidest of all." Vincent winced, but before he could announce his presence, Amara's voice stopped him cold. "Your daddy isn't stupid, sweetheart. He's scared." "Scared of what?" Michael lifted his head to look at her. "He's the strongest person in the world." "Being strong and being scared aren't opposites," Amara said gently. "Sometimes the strongest people are scared of the most important things. Like loving someone new after they've lost someone they loved very much." Vincent's breath caught. She was defending him. To his own children. After everything he'd put her through, she was still protecting him from their judgment. "But you love us," Mason said with 8-year-old logic. "And we love you. Daddy should be happy about that, not scared." "Love is complicated when you're a grown-up," Amara whispered. "Your daddy loved your mama so much that when he lost her, it felt like losing a piece of his heart. Sometimes people build walls around the pieces that are left, to keep them safe. But walls that keep hurt out also keep love out. Is that why he's saying those mean things about you?" Michael's voice was very small. "Because he's scared to love you." The silence stretched so long that Vincent wondered if Amara would answer at all. When she did, her voice was barely audible. "I don't know, baby. Maybe. Or maybe he just really believes I'm not good enough for your family." "That's the stupidest thing ever," Mason said with fierce loyalty. "You're the best person we know. You make the best pancakes and you know all the words to our favorite songs and you never get tired of reading the same story 50 million times. And you smell like cookies and hugs," Michael added solemnly, as if this were the highest praise possible. Vincent felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, but opening. Like a door he'd kept locked finally giving way. "Boys." His voice made all 3 of them turn. Mason and Michael didn't move from Amara's arms, but their expressions grew wary. Amara's face went carefully blank, the look she'd perfected over months of navigating his unpredictable moods. "Daddy," Mason said, his chin lifted in defiance. "We're not sorry for telling the truth." "I know." Vincent stepped into the chapel, removing his suit jacket and sitting heavily in the pew across from them. Without the armor of expensive tailoring, he looked smaller somehow. More human. "I'm not here to scold you." "Then why are you here?" Michael asked, but his tone was curious rather than hostile. Vincent looked at Amara, really looked at her, and saw exhaustion deeper than bone. She'd been fighting his accusations for months while still somehow managing to love his children unconditionally. Still defending him to them even as he destroyed her reputation in open court. "I came to find you," he said simply. "When I realized you were gone, He swallowed hard. "I panicked. The thought of losing you, both of you, it made me remember things I've been trying to forget." "What things?" Mason asked, some of his defensiveness softening. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was different, raw, unguarded. "The night your mama died, she made me promise something. She was so sick, but she held my hand and said, 'Vincent, promise me you won't let grief make you forget how to love. Promise me you'll let the boys see you be happy again.' And I promised her. But keeping that promise felt like betraying her memory. The silence in the chapel was profound. Even the sounds from the hallway seemed muted, as if the small sacred space existed outside the chaos of the courthouse. Mama wouldn't want you to be sad forever, Daddy, Michael said softly. She always said love makes more love. It doesn't run out. Vincent's eyes burned. When did you get so wise? Amara taught us that, Mason said, snuggling closer to her. When we were sad about missing Mama, she said love doesn't die when people die. It just finds new ways to grow. Vincent looked at Amara then, and saw her fighting tears. You told them that? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Even though you knew it meant they'd never stop missing Sarah? Even though it meant you'd always come second? I never wanted to come first, Amara whispered. I just wanted to belong somewhere. To matter to someone. These boys, she tightened her arms around them. They gave me a family when I thought I'd never have one. And what about me? The question escaped before Vincent could stop it. Did I ever matter? Amara was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she did, her voice was steady but distant. You know you did. But it doesn't matter now, does it? You've made it clear what you think of me. What you believe I'm capable of. I was wrong. The words came out in a rush. About the jewelry, about the money, about your reasons for. Were you? Amara's interruption was gentle but cutting. Because 30 minutes ago, you accused your own sons of lying to protect me. You turned their love into evidence of manipulation. If you can doubt them so easily, how can I believe you won't doubt me again the next time fear tells you I'm a threat? The question hung between them like a sword. Because she was right. In the courtroom, faced with evidence that vindicated her, his first instinct had been suspicion. His fear of vulnerability had been stronger than his trust in her character. I don't know, he admitted finally. I don't know how to prove to you that I can be better. That I can choose love over fear. Maybe you can't, Amara said quietly. Maybe some walls are too high to climb over. Mason looked between his father and Amara with the clarity only children possess. But walls can come down, right? If people want them to. Vincent met his son's eyes, so much like Sarah's, so full of hope despite everything, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. Yes, he said, his voice rough with emotion. If people want them to badly enough, walls can come down. Do you want yours to come down, Daddy? Michael asked with devastating simplicity. The chapel fell silent again. Outside, Vincent could hear his lawyers calling his name, probably frantic about the delay. The legal machinery that had been set in motion waited for no one's emotional revelations. But in this moment, in this small space that felt removed from the world's demands, only one thing mattered. The truth. Yes, he whispered, looking at Amara. I do. But I don't know if it's too late. Amara studied his face for a long moment, searching for something, sincerity, perhaps, or the man she'd glimpsed in quiet moments before fear had made him cruel. I don't know either, she said finally. But for their sake, she looked down at Mason and Michael, maybe we owe it to them to find out. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a promise. But it was a door left slightly ajar, and Vincent found himself grateful for even that small mercy. Mr. Ashford. A bailiff appeared in the doorway. Judge Hawkins is ready to reconvene. The real world crashed back in. Cameras, lawyers, a legal proceeding that would determine not just Amara's reputation but the custody of his children's hearts. Vincent stood slowly, understanding that the next few minutes would reshape all their lives. Whatever happens up there, he said to Amara, I need you to know, I never stopped believing in your love for them. I just stopped trusting my own judgment about people I could lose. Amara stood too, smoothing Mason's hair, adjusting Michael's rumpled uniform. When she looked at Vincent again, something had shifted in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. Then maybe it's time to start, she said simply. And together, they walked back toward the courtroom where justice waited, imperfect, uncertain, but finally, possibly, within reach. What do you think it takes to rebuild trust once it's been broken? Is love enough, or does it require something more? Let us know your thoughts below. The courtroom felt different when they returned, charged with an electricity that made the air itself seem to hum. Judge Hawkins studied the faces before her with the keen eye of someone who'd spent decades watching human drama unfold in her domain. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "before we proceed, I want to clarify something with your client. Mr. Ashford, are you prepared to continue with these proceedings given the new testimony from your sons?" Vincent stood slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. His legal team looked like they were watching their carefully constructed case crumble in real time. The reporters leaned forward, sensing a story that had just gotten much more complicated. "Your Honor," he began, then stopped. The words he'd prepared, the careful legal language his lawyers had coached him to use, felt wrong somehow. False. Instead, he found himself looking at Amara, who sat with her hands folded, her expression unreadable. And suddenly, he was back in his kitchen on a rainy Thursday evening 2 years ago, watching her teach his sons to make Sarah's favorite cookies from a recipe card yellowed with age and tears. "Your Honor," he started again, his voice rougher now. "I think the court, and the jury, deserves to understand the full context of this case. The history that led us here." Morrison half rose in panic. "Mr. Ashford, I strongly advise." "The history I created," Vincent continued, ignoring his lawyer's frantic signals. "The mistakes I made that turned love into suspicion." Judge Hawkins leaned forward. "Are you asking to testify, Mr. Ashford?" "I am." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Vincent's security chief looked apoplectic. His lawyers were conferring in sharp whispers. But Vincent's attention was focused on Amara's face, watching as confusion flickered across her carefully controlled expression. "Very well," Judge Hawkins said. "Please be sworn in." Minutes later, Vincent sat in the witness chair, his hand still tingling from the oath he'd just taken. Truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He'd spent months hiding from the truth. Now it was time to let it breathe. "Mr. Ashford," the judge prompted gently. "You wanted to provide context. Please proceed." Vincent took a breath and let himself remember. 3 years ago, my wife Sarah died of cancer. She was 34 years old. His voice caught slightly. The boys were 5. They'd watched their mother waste away for 8 months, and by the time she died, they'd stopped talking. Stopped playing. Michael started hoarding food. Mason would only sleep in our closet because it still smelled like her perfume. In the gallery, he could see Mason and Michael leaning forward, listening to their story told in a way they'd never heard before. "I wasn't much better. I threw myself into work, traveled constantly, hired a series of nannies who lasted a few weeks at most because the boys were." He swallowed hard. "They were angry. At me, at God, at anyone who tried to care for them. They'd had 6 different caregivers in 4 months when the agency sent Amara." He looked at her then, and saw her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I remember the exact moment I knew she was different. I came home from a business trip to find her sitting on the kitchen floor with both boys, all 3 of them covered in flour. They were making a mess, the kind of mess I'd specifically told previous nannies was unacceptable. But they were laughing." Vincent's voice grew softer, lost in the memory. "I hadn't heard my sons laugh in 8 months. 8 months of silence and tantrums and nights when they'd scream for their mother until they exhausted themselves. But there was Amara, teaching them to make bread because, she said, sometimes when life falls apart, you need to make something rise." Several jury members were visibly moved. In the defendant's chair, Amara pressed her fingers to her lips. That night, Mason slept in his own bed for the first time since Sarah died. Michael ate a full meal without hiding half of it. "And I." Vincent paused. "I sat in my study and cried because I realized I'd forgotten what my children's laughter sounded like." "What was Miss Jolie's role in your household beyond childcare?" Judge Hawkins asked gently. "Everything." The word came out fierce with conviction. "She became everything we needed her to be. Nurse when they were sick, teacher when they struggled with school, friend when they needed someone to listen. She learned all of Sarah's lullabies, memorized their favorite bedtime stories, figured out that Mason needed his eggs cut into shapes and Michael couldn't stand the sound of the vacuum cleaner." Vincent turned to address the jury directly. "She never tried to replace their mother. Instead, she honored Sarah's memory by loving the boys the way Sarah would have wanted them loved, completely, unconditionally, with endless patience for their healing." "And your relationship with Miss Jolie?" the judge prompted. Here it was. The truth he'd been running from. "I fell in love with her." The admission seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Somewhere between watching her sing my boys to sleep and finding her asleep in their room after staying all night when they had fevers, I fell completely, terrifyingly in love with her. Morrison looked like he might faint. The jury was riveted. But Vincent only had eyes for Amara, whose careful composure had finally cracked. Terrifying? Judge Hawkins asked. Because loving her meant admitting that life could be good again. That I deserved happiness after Sarah. That maybe, his voice broke slightly, maybe Sarah's death wasn't punishment for something I'd done wrong. Maybe it was just terrible, random loss, and maybe I was allowed to heal from it. Vincent ran his hands through his hair, destroying the careful styling. I don't know what to say, she whispered. I don't know how to process what you just did. Neither do I, he admitted. I just knew I couldn't let you leave thinking you meant nothing to me. From across the courtroom, Mason and Michael had broken free of their handler and were running toward them, their small faces bright with hope and confusion. Daddy. Mason reached them first, throwing his arms around Vincent's waist. Does this mean you're not mad at Amara anymore? Does this mean she can come home? Michael added, wrapping himself around Amara like a koala clinging to a tree. The simple questions from innocent hearts cut through the complexity of adult emotions like a knife through silk. Vincent knelt down to his son's level, suddenly aware that every word he spoke now would shape not just this moment, but their understanding of love and forgiveness for the rest of their lives. I was never really mad at Amara, boys. I was scared and confused, and I made terrible mistakes because of it. But you said sorry, Mason pointed out with 8-year-old logic. Mama always said sorry fixes things if you really mean it. Vincent's eyes found Amara's over his son's head. Sorry is just the beginning, buddy. Sometimes when you hurt someone badly, it takes more than words to fix things. Like what? Michael asked, still clinging to Amara as if letting go might make her disappear. Like time, Amara said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Like proving you mean what you say. Like earning back trust that got broken. But you love each other, Mason said with the devastating clarity only children possessed. We heard Daddy say it. And you love us. Love fixes everything, right? The adults exchanged a look heavy with shared pain and fragile hope. Love helps, Vincent said carefully. But sometimes love needs help too. Judge Hawkins had left the bench, but the courtroom was still buzzing with activity. Vincent's legal team huddled in frantic conference calls. Reporters typed frantically on phones. Court staff prepared dismissal papers. But in their small bubble, time seemed suspended. There's a garden behind the courthouse, Amara said suddenly. Could we go somewhere quieter? I can't think with all this noise. Minutes later, they sat on a weathered bench in the small memorial garden, watching Mason and Michael chase butterflies among the roses. The October sun was warm on their faces, and for the first time in months, Vincent felt like he could breathe fully. I need you to understand something, Amara said, her voice barely above a whisper. What you did in there, telling the truth, dropping the charges, it doesn't erase the last 6 months. Vincent's chest tightened. I know. I spent nights crying myself to sleep, wondering what I'd done wrong. I lost weight because I couldn't eat. I stopped singing because joy felt impossible when the man I loved looked at me like I was poison. Her words were quiet, but they landed like physical blows. Vincent forced himself to listen, to absorb the full weight of the damage he'd caused. I applied for jobs in other cities, Vincent. I was going to disappear from their lives because I thought that's what you wanted. I thought you decided I was dangerous to them. Amara. Let me finish. She turned to face him fully. I need to say this while I still can. You broke something in me. The part that believed I could be worth fighting for. The part that thought maybe I'd finally found a place where I belonged. Vincent's vision blurred. I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry, Amara. I know sorry isn't enough, but Why? The question came out sharp, desperate. Why did you choose to believe the worst of me instead of just asking? If you were scared about the jewelry, why didn't you just talk to me? Vincent was quiet for a long time, watching his sons play, gathering the courage to excavate the deepest parts of his fear. Because Sarah died on a Thursday, he said finally. Amara frowned. What does that have to do with? She died on a Thursday, and that morning she'd asked me to stay home from a business meeting. Said she had a feeling it might be one of her last good days. But I went anyway, told her the meeting was too important to reschedule. Vincent's voice grew rough. She died while I was in a conference room arguing about quarterly projections. Understanding dawned slowly in Amara's eyes. I was so sure I knew what was important, Vincent continued. So confident in my judgment. And I was catastrophically wrong. The meeting meant nothing. Sarah was everything, and I missed her last words because I was too arrogant to listen to what she was trying to tell me. Vincent. So when the jewelry went missing, when the evidence pointed to you, I couldn't trust my own judgment. Because my judgment had already failed me in the worst possible way. If I could be wrong about something as simple as staying home with my dying wife, how could I trust that I wasn't being fooled by a woman who seemed too good to be true? Amara was quiet, absorbing this revelation. So you chose to believe evidence over everything you'd witnessed about my character. I chose fear over love, Vincent said simply. I chose the safety of expecting the worst over the risk of being wrong again. They sat in silence, watching Mason show Michael how to make a butterfly land on his finger. The boys' laughter carried on the breeze, innocent and pure. The night you kissed me, Amara said suddenly. Under the Christmas tree. Was that real? It was the most real I'd felt since Sarah died. Vincent's answer was immediate, fervent. Everything I said that night, about loving you, about wanting you to stay forever, I meant every word. Then why was it so easy to throw away? Vincent closed his eyes. Because keeping it felt like betraying Sarah. Because being happy with you felt like admitting I was glad she was gone. Because, his voice broke. Because I loved you so much it terrified me. Love isn't supposed to be terrifying, Vincent. Isn't it? He looked at her with eyes full of pain and hope. When you love someone the way I love you, when they become essential to your breathing, your existing, your son's happiness, isn't that the most terrifying thing in the world? Knowing you could lose them. Amara felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. So you decided to lose me first. I decided to push you away before you could realize you deserved better than a broken widower and his traumatized children. That wasn't your choice to make, she said, but her voice was gentler now. You should have let me decide what I deserved. You're right. Vincent turned to face her fully. I stole that choice from you. I stole 6 months of happiness from all of us because I was too scared to trust that good things can last. Mason had wandered over and was leaning against Amara's knees, looking up at her with serious eyes. Are you gonna forgive Daddy? He's really sorry. Look how sad he is. Amara smoothed Mason's hair, her heart breaking all over again at the hope in his young face. Forgiveness is complicated, sweetheart. No, it's not, Michael said, joining his brother. You love someone, they say sorry, you hug it out. That's what you taught us. From the mouths of babes, Vincent murmured. Amara looked at him then, really looked at him. Saw the man she'd fallen in love with underneath the fear and pride. Saw the father who'd just risked everything to tell the truth. Saw the broken human being who'd let trauma turn love into terror. I can't just flip a switch and trust you again, she said quietly. I can't pretend the last 6 months didn't happen. Vincent's face fell, but he nodded. I understand. But, Amara continued, and his head snapped up, I also can't pretend that what we had wasn't real. That you don't mean everything to me. That these boys aren't already my children in every way that matters. Hope flickered in Vincent's eyes like a candle flame. So what do we do? He asked. Amara was quiet for a moment, watching the boys who'd never stopped believing that love could conquer everything. We start over, she said finally. Not where we left off, but from the beginning. We rebuild trust piece by piece. We learn to choose love over fear, even when it's scary. And if I mess up again? If my fear makes me stupid again? Amara's smile was small but genuine. Then we'll deal with it together. Because that's what families do. They mess up, they forgive, they try again. Vincent felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for months. Is that what we are? A family? We always were, Amara said, looking at Mason and Michael. Even when you forgot. For the first time in half a year, Vincent smiled, really smiled, and reached for her hand. When she didn't pull away, when her fingers intertwined with his, he felt like he could breathe again. I love you, he whispered. I never stopped loving you. I know, she whispered back. I never stopped either. Even when I hated you, I loved you. Gross. Mason announced. Are you gonna kiss now? That's what happens in movies. Michael giggled. They should kiss. Like in Sleeping Beauty. Vincent and Amara looked at each other and started laughing, the first real laughter either had experienced in months. And suddenly, everything felt possible again. Do you believe people can truly change, or do we just get better at managing our fears? When someone you love hurts you deeply, what does forgiveness really look like? Share your thoughts below. The fragile piece of the garden shattered like glass against concrete when Vincent's phone buzzed with an urgent call. His face went pale as he read the caller ID, and Amara felt her stomach drop before he even answered. I have to take this, he said, stepping away from the bench. Morrison, what? His voice cut off as he listened, his expression growing darker with each passing second. Mason and Michael had returned to the butterflies, oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults. Amara watched Vincent's face transform from the soft vulnerability he'd just shown her back into the hard mask of a businessman under attack. No, he said sharply into the phone. Absolutely not. I don't care what the board thinks. He paused, listening. What do you mean, emergency meeting? Amara's chest tightened. She'd seen this before, the way Vincent's corporate world could swallow him whole, turning him from the man who laughed with his children into the cold billionaire who trusted no one. Vincent ended the call and stood frozen for a moment, his back to her. When he turned around, something had changed in his eyes. What is it? She asked, though part of her didn't want to know. The board called an emergency meeting. Someone leaked details of today's proceedings to the financial press. His voice was flat, professional. The headlines are already running. Billionaire CEO files false charges against employee. Ashford Industries stock plummets on scandal. They're questioning my judgment, my fitness to lead the company. Vincent. There's more. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. They're demanding I undergo a psychological evaluation. Corporate therapy to prove I'm mentally stable enough to continue as CEO. Amara felt the first chill of foreboding. That doesn't sound so bad. You could use someone to talk to about. They want to evaluate my personal relationships too. The words came out sharp, cutting. Specifically, they want to understand why I was living with and became romantically involved with domestic staff. They're calling it a pattern of poor judgment and inappropriate boundary management. The words hit Amara like a physical blow. Domestic staff. Not the woman who'd loved his children, not his partner, not even his girlfriend. Just hired help who'd overstepped her bounds. I see, she said quietly, pulling her hands back from his. No, you don't see. Vincent's voice rose slightly. You don't understand what's at stake here. Ashford Industries employs 12,000 people. My decision-making affects pension funds, college savings, mortgages. I understand perfectly. Amara stood, brushing off her dress with careful dignity. I understand that I'm an embarrassment to you. A liability. The hired help who forgot her place. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? She faced him fully, and he could see the walls going back up in her eyes. 10 minutes ago you were talking about rebuilding trust, about being a family. Now your board disapproves, and suddenly I'm a personal relationship that needs to be evaluated for appropriateness. Vincent ran his hands through his hair, frustrated. Amara, you're twisting my words. I'm just trying to explain the pressure. The pressure. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Right. The pressure of being with someone beneath your social class. The pressure of explaining to your wealthy peers why you fell for the nanny. Stop. Vincent's voice went cold, and Amara felt her heart crack. There he was again, the man who'd accused her in court, who'd let fear turn him cruel. You're being unfair. Unfair. The word came out sharp enough to make Mason and Michael look up from their butterfly chase. Amara lowered her voice, but the pain was clear. I'm being realistic. The second your precious company is threatened, the second your reputation is at stake, I become a problem to be managed instead of a person to be loved. That's not true. Then prove it. She crossed her arms, waiting. Tell me you're going to walk into that boardroom and tell them exactly what you told the court today. Tell me you're going to stand up and say that you love me, that we're going to be together regardless of what they think. Vincent opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. I thought so, Amara whispered. It's not that simple, Vincent said finally. I have responsibilities. To everyone except the people who actually love you. Don't be naive, Amara. The real world doesn't work like fairy tales. There are consequences to public scandals, too. Naive. The word came out like a slap. I'm naive for believing that love should matter more than stock prices. I'm naive for thinking that a man who claims to love me wouldn't immediately start calculating the cost of that love the moment it becomes inconvenient. Vincent felt his own anger rising, fed by months of stress and the impossible position he found himself in. You have no idea what it's like to carry the weight I carry. To have thousands of jobs depending on your decisions. You can't just think about what you want. What I want. Amara's voice rose despite her efforts to keep the children from hearing. What I want is to stop being treated like a dirty secret. What I want is to not have the man I love look ashamed to be seen with me the moment his friends start talking. I'm not ashamed. Then why are you already planning to choose them over me? The question hung in the air like a sword. Because that's exactly what Vincent was doing, and they both knew it. In his mind, he was already calculating damage control, already figuring out how to distance himself from the scandal, already choosing his company over his heart. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen, Amara said quietly, the fight going out of her voice. This is why I knew it was impossible from the beginning. Why I should have said no when you kissed me under that Christmas tree. Amara. No. She held up a hand, stopping him. You were right the first time, Vincent. We're from different worlds. You'll always have to choose between your world and me, and you'll always choose your world. Because it's safer. Because it's what you know. Because loving me is a risk you can't afford to take. That's not fair, Vincent said, but his voice lacked conviction. Because deep down, wasn't she right? Wasn't he already calculating how to minimize the damage to his reputation, his company, his carefully ordered life? Life isn't fair, Amara replied. But I'm done pretending otherwise. She turned toward Mason and Michael, who were watching with wide, confused eyes. Boys, come here please. They ran over, sensing the shift in the adult's mood. Are you fighting again? Mason asked, his voice small. Are you gonna leave us again? Michael's question was barely a whisper. Amara knelt down, gathering them both into her arms one last time. I want you to remember something, okay? I love you both more than all the stars in the sky. Nothing will ever change that. Not distance, not time, not anything. But you're leaving, Mason said, tears starting to flow. Your daddy has to make some important decisions about his business. And sometimes, those decisions mean that people like me can't stay. Vincent felt like he was watching a train wreck in slow motion. Amara, don't do this. Not like this. She stood, facing him with eyes full of heartbreak but also a terrible resolve. You're going to walk into that boardroom and choose them. We both know it. So I'm saving us all the humiliation of watching you do it. If you leave now, Vincent's voice was desperate. If you walk away, there's no coming back from this. I walked away 6 months ago when you decided I was a criminal, Amara replied. This is just making it official. She picked up her purse, the same worn bag she'd clutched like armor in the courthouse hallway that morning. How long ago that seemed now. Tell your board they have nothing to worry about, she said with dignity that broke Vincent's heart. The inappropriate relationship is over. The liability has been removed. Amara, please. But she was already walking away, leaving Vincent standing in the garden with 2 crying children and the wreckage of his second chance at happiness. His phone buzzed again. Another call from Morrison, probably demanding he return for the boardroom emergency. Vincent looked at his sons, at the path where Amara had disappeared, at the choice that felt impossible but had somehow already been made. He answered the phone. Vincent, thank God. Morrison's voice was sharp with urgency. We need you here now. The board is in full crisis mode, and the press is. I'm on my way, Vincent said, his voice hollow. As he gathered his sons and headed toward his car, Vincent told himself he was being practical. Responsible. That sometimes love wasn't enough when the real world came calling. But deep down, he knew the truth. He'd just proven Amara right about everything. When forced to choose between love and safety, between her and his carefully controlled world, he'd chosen exactly what she'd predicted. And this time, he might have lost her forever. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between love and security? Between your heart and the expectations of others? How did you decide? And do you regret your choice? Let us know below. The Ashford Industries boardroom on the 42nd floor commanded a view of the entire city, but Vincent saw none of it. He sat at the head of the mahogany table, surrounded by 12 of the most powerful people in the business world, their faces ranging from concerned to accusatory to coldly calculating. Vincent, Chairman Harold Whitmore's voice carried the authority of old money and older prejudices. We've known each other for 15 years. I've watched you build this company into an empire. But today's spectacle has the board questioning whether personal entanglements have compromised your judgment. Vincent's hands were folded on the table, but inside, his heart was racing. 3 hours had passed since Amara walked away from him in the garden. 3 hours of emergency board meetings, crisis management calls, and watching his company's stock price fluctuate with every new headline. 3 hours of his sons asking when Amara was coming home. The optics are devastating, continued board member Patricia Chen, sliding a tablet across the table. Look at these headlines. Billionaire CEO's false accusations against household staff. Love triangle or power play. The financial blogs are having a field day. Vincent glanced at the screen and felt sick. Photos of him and Amara from the courthouse, twisted into sensational stories about wealthy men preying on vulnerable employees. The truth, that he'd fallen in love with a woman who'd saved his family, had been warped into something ugly and exploitative. Our shareholders are spooked, added CFO Richard Sterling. Stocks down 8% in 3 hours. The pension funds asking questions. We need decisive action. What kind of action? Vincent asked quietly. Whitmore leaned forward. A clean break. Public statement distancing yourself from the domestic situation. Corporate therapy to demonstrate you're taking steps to maintain appropriate boundaries. Perhaps a sabbatical while this blows over. You want me to throw her under the bus? It wasn't a question. We want you to remember that you're not just Vincent Ashford, Patricia said firmly. You're the CEO of a company that employs 12,000 people. Your personal choices affect pension funds, college savings, mortgage payments. Sometimes leadership means making hard choices. Vincent thought of Amara's words in the garden. You'll always choose your world over me. Had she been right? Was he really so predictable, so controlled by fear and convention? His phone buzzed. A text from his housekeeper. The boys asking for Amara. They won't eat dinner. Michael is hiding in the closet again. Michael. Back in Sarah's closet. Back to the broken child he'd been before Amara brought light into their darkness. Gentlemen, ladies, Vincent said slowly. You're asking me to sacrifice the woman I love to protect stock prices. We're asking you to be a leader, Whitmore replied. To put the greater good ahead of personal desires. Vincent stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. 42 floors below, the city sprawled in every direction, millions of people going about their lives, most of them unaware that the man at the top of this glass tower was facing the defining choice of his life. Tell me, he said without turning around, how many of you have been married? The question caught them off guard. Vincent, I don't see how. All of you, he continued. Every single person in this room has found love, made a commitment, built a life with someone. Patricia, you've been married to David for 20 years. Harold, you and Margaret just celebrated your 30th anniversary. He turned to face them. Did any of your spouses have to pass a board evaluation? Did you have to prove to shareholders that your love was financially sound? That's different, Patricia said stiffly. We married within our social circles, people with appropriate backgrounds. Appropriate. Vincent's voice was quiet, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. You mean white. You mean wealthy. You mean people who look like us and talk like us and never challenge us to be better than we are. The boardroom went silent. Amara Jolie saved my family, Vincent continued, his voice growing stronger. When my sons were broken by grief, when I was drowning in guilt and anger, she put us back together piece by piece. She didn't care about my money or my connections or my stock options. She cared about 2 little boys who needed love and a man who'd forgotten how to give it. Vincent, Whitmore tried to interrupt. I'm not finished. The authority in Vincent's voice was absolute now. For 3 years, she loved us unconditionally. She never asked for anything except the chance to belong somewhere, to matter to someone. And when I was too scared to trust that goodness, when I let fear turn me into a monster who accused her of theft, she never once retaliated. She protected my sons even as I destroyed her reputation. Vincent moved to the head of the table, placing his hands on the mahogany surface. Today in that courtroom, I had a choice. I could protect my image, maintain the lie, preserve my reputation. Or I could tell the truth and face the consequences. I chose truth. And now you're asking me to go back on that choice because it's inconvenient for stock prices. We're asking you to be realistic, Richard said. Romance is nice, Vincent, but we have fiduciary responsibilities. To hell with your responsibilities. The words came out sharp and final. You want to know what's realistic? Realistic is that I'm 40 years old and I've found love twice in my life. Sarah was stolen from me by cancer. Amara is being stolen from me by cowardice. Mine and yours. Vincent looked around the table at faces he'd worked with for years, people he'd considered friends. You're asking me to choose between love and money, between happiness and stock prices, between the woman who saved my family and the approval of people who measure worth in quarterly earnings. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to the photo that was his wallpaper. Amara reading to Mason and Michael on Christmas morning, all 3 of them in pajamas, laughing at something in the storybook. This woman taught my sons to laugh again. She taught me that hearts can heal, that love doesn't dishonor the memory of those we've lost, that second chances are gifts we don't deserve but should treasure anyway. Vincent set the phone on the table where everyone could see the image. And you want me to sacrifice her because some investors are nervous about headlines. The silence stretched for a long moment. Finally, Whitmore cleared his throat. Vincent, we understand you have feelings for this woman. But feelings aren't good business sense. The market responds to perception, and the perception, Vincent interrupted, is exactly what I make it. He moved to his laptop and began typing rapidly. Within moments, he'd pulled up the Ashford Industries website and was drafting a statement. What are you doing? Patricia asked nervously. Making a choice, Vincent replied, still typing. The choice I should have made 3 years ago, 6 months ago, 3 hours ago. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he composed what might be the most important words of his professional life. Asterisk statement from Vincent Ashford, CEO of Ashford Industries. Today I stood in a courtroom and told the truth about the worst mistake of my life. I falsely accused Amara Jolie, a woman of extraordinary character and integrity, because fear made me a coward and grief made me cruel. Ms. Jolie has been more than an employee to my family. She has been our salvation, our healer, our light in the darkest period of our lives. She loved my children as her own and offered me a second chance at happiness that I was too damaged to accept gracefully. I am not ashamed of loving her. I am ashamed of how poorly I loved her. To my shareholders, board members, and business partners, if my personal happiness threatens your financial interests, I understand your concern. But I will not sacrifice love for profit margins, truth for stock prices, or family for the approval of those who measure worth in dollars rather than humanity. Effective immediately, I am taking a personal leave of absence to focus on what truly matters, winning back the trust of the woman I love and being the father my sons deserve. The company will continue to thrive under the capable leadership of our executive team. But I refuse to lead a life that prioritizes corporate image over human connection. Some things are more important than quarterly earnings. Love is one of them. Asterisk. Vincent's finger hovered over the publish button. Vincent, don't. Whitmore's voice was sharp with panic. Think about what you're doing. You'll destroy everything you've built. No, Vincent said quietly. I'm finally building something that matters. He clicked publish and watched as the statement went live on the company website, pushed to every major financial news outlet, shared across social media platforms. Within seconds, his phone was exploding with calls and messages. The boardroom erupted in chaos. Patricia was frantically calling the legal team. Richard was calculating stock impact. Whitmore looked like he might have a stroke. But Vincent was already packing his briefcase, already thinking about the woman who'd walked away from him in a courthouse garden, already planning how to prove that some choices, the ones that really matter, are never made in boardrooms. Where are you going? Whitmore demanded. Vincent paused at the door, looking back at the people who'd spent the afternoon trying to convince him that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. "I'm going to get my family back," he said simply. "All of it." And for the first time in months, Vincent Ashford knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. The only question now was whether it was too late to prove it to the woman who'd already given him more chances than he deserved. As he left the building, Vincent's phone buzzed with a text from his housekeeper. "Sir, Miss Amara came by for her things. She said to tell the boys she loves them. She's flying to Atlanta tonight." Vincent looked at his watch. 8:47 p.m. Her flight was at 11:30. He had 2 hours and 43 minutes to undo months of damage, to choose love over everything else that had seemed so important. 2 hours and 43 minutes to prove that sometimes, the most important boardroom decision is the one to walk away from the boardroom entirely. When have you had to choose between what others expected of you and what your heart knew was right? What did that choice cost you, and was it worth it? Share your story below. The airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of departing flights, but Vincent moved through it like a man possessed. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled from running, and his heart hammered against his ribs as he scanned every face, searching for the one that mattered most. Gate A23. Atlanta. 11:30 p.m. departure. He'd broken every traffic law getting here, abandoned his car in a no-parking zone, and sprinted through security with the kind of desperate urgency reserved for life-or-death moments. Because that's what this was, the death of everything that mattered or the birth of everything he'd ever wanted. His phone had been ringing non-stop since he'd left the boardroom. The financial news networks, his board members, reporters sensing a story. But Vincent had turned it off somewhere between the courthouse and home, where he'd found Mason and Michael sitting by the front door with their backpacks packed. "We're coming with you, Daddy," Mason had said with 8-year-old determination. "Amara needs all of us to tell her we're sorry." "She probably won't believe just you," Michael had added with devastating honesty. "You made her really sad. But she might believe us too." Now his sons flanked him as they approached the gate, their small hands gripping his tightly, their faces set with the same resolve that had driven them to burst into a courtroom that morning. "Do you see her, Daddy?" Mason asked, standing on his tiptoes to peer over the crowd. Vincent's eyes swept the gate area, his chest tight with the fear that they were too late, that she'd already boarded, that his moment of clarity had come 60 seconds after her departure. Then he saw her. Amara sat in the corner by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her worn purse on her lap, staring out at the runway where planes took off into the night sky. She looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way that made Vincent's throat close with regret. Her natural hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same navy dress from court, the one she'd chosen because it was her best, because she'd wanted to face his accusations with dignity. "Amara." Michael's voice cut through the gate area noise as he broke free from Vincent's grip and ran toward her. She turned, and Vincent saw the exact moment she registered their presence. Surprise, then pain, then a careful blankness that broke his heart all over again. "Boys." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the cost of that control. "What are you doing here?" Mason had joined his brother, both of them climbing into the seats beside her with the easy familiarity of children who'd never doubted their welcome in her arms. "We came to stop you," Mason announced. "You can't leave. We need you." "We packed our bags too," Michael added, pulling a small backpack into view. "If you have to go to Atlanta, we'll come with you." Amara's composure cracked slightly. "Oh, sweetheart, you can't." "Why not?" Mason's logic was unassailable. "Families stay together. You're our family." Vincent approached slowly, as if sudden movements might cause her to flee. "Amara." She looked up at him, and he saw exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that went deeper than physical tiredness. This was the weariness of someone who'd fought for love and lost too many times. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "Don't you have a board meeting? Damage control to manage." "I quit." The words hung in the air between them. Amara blinked, certain she'd misheard. "What?" Vincent sat down across from her, his sons creating a protective barrier on either side of her chair. "I walked out of the boardroom. Made a public statement choosing you over everything else. Took a leave of absence to focus on what actually matters." Amara stared at him. "You quit your job." "I chose my family," he corrected. "I chose love over fear, truth over reputation, you over everyone who thinks you're not worth fighting for." She shook her head slowly. "Vincent, you can't just You built that company from nothing. It's your life's work. No. His voice was quiet but certain. You are my life's work. These boys are my life's work. Love is my life's work. Everything else is just business. But the stock prices, the board, all those people depending on, will be fine without me micromanaging their lives. Vincent leaned forward. Amara, I spent so many years thinking that success meant controlling everything, protecting everyone, never showing weakness. But you know what I learned today? She waited, not trusting her voice. The strongest thing I've ever done was stand in that courtroom and admit I was wrong. The most successful moment of my career was walking away from people who wanted me to choose money over you. Flight 1247 to Atlanta, now boarding first-class passengers, the gate agent announced. Amara glanced at the boarding area, then back at Vincent. You're too late. Am I? The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything. Months of pain, years of love, a future hanging in the balance. I don't know how to trust you again, she whispered. I don't know how to believe that you won't change your mind the next time choosing me becomes inconvenient. Then don't, Vincent said, and her eyes widened in surprise. Don't trust me. Trust them. He nodded toward Mason and Michael, who were watching the adult conversation with the intensity of children who understood that their world was being decided. Trust that two little boys who've already lost one mother aren't wrong about who loves them unconditionally. Trust that they see something in you that's worth fighting for, worth rebuilding a life around. Now boarding rows 1 through 5, the agent called. Amara's boarding pass crumpled slightly in her grip. Vincent. Trust that love isn't about being perfect, he continued, his voice growing stronger. It's about choosing each other even when it's hard, even when you're scared, even when the whole world tells you you're making a mistake. Mason slipped his small hand into hers. Please don't go, Amara. We promised to help Daddy be better at loving you. We'll remind him every day that you're the best thing that ever happened to us, Michael added solemnly. Amara looked down at these two perfect children who'd never stopped believing in love, even when the adults in their lives had lost faith. And if I stay? She asked quietly. What then? We pretend the last 6 months didn't happen? We go back to the way things were. No, Vincent said firmly. We start fresh. We do this right this time. We build something new, something honest, something strong enough to weather whatever storms come our way. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made Amara's breath catch. This was Sarah's, he said, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. She wanted me to give it to someone who loved our boys as much as she did. Someone who could teach them that love doesn't end when people die, it just finds new ways to grow. Amara's eyes filled with tears. Vincent. I'm not asking you to marry me tonight, he said quickly. I'm asking you to come home with us. To let me spend every day proving that I choose you, that I choose us, that love is worth more than every stock price and board approval in the world. Final boarding call for Flight 1247 to Atlanta. The gate area had emptied around them, passengers filing onto the plane that would take her away from everything they'd built together. Vincent held his breath as Amara looked at the boarding gate, then at the ring, then at the faces of the two children who'd called her their real mother in a courtroom that morning. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I, Vincent admitted. Terrified. But I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of loving you. Amara closed her eyes, and when she opened them, something had shifted. The careful walls she'd built around her heart were cracking, letting in light she'd thought she'd never feel again. If we do this, she said slowly, if I come home with you, there are going to be rules. Vincent nodded eagerly. Anything. No more secrets. No more making decisions about us without including me in the conversation. Agreed. And if you ever let fear make you doubt me again, if you ever choose your reputation over our relationship, I'm gone. For good. No more chances. I understand. And, Amara's voice grew stronger, more certain, you have to promise me something else. Name it. She looked down at Mason and Michael, then back at Vincent. You have to promise me that we're going to be a real family. Not a billionaire and his employee, not an arrangement of convenience, but a real family where everyone belongs equally. Vincent felt tears burning his eyes. Amara Jolie, you've been my family from the moment you taught my sons to laugh again. You've been their mother since the day you chose to love broken people back to wholeness. You've been my heart since the night you cried over Christmas presents because you wanted them to feel loved by Sarah forever. He slipped from his chair to one knee, right there in the airport gate, ignoring the scattered passengers who'd stopped to watch. You are my family. You are my love. You are my second chance at everything beautiful in this world. Will you come home with us? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that love is stronger than fear? The gate agent had moved on to final passenger checks. In moments, the door would close and the plane would taxi away. But Amara was looking at Vincent, really looking at him, and seeing not the cold businessman who'd accused her or the scared widower who'd pushed her away, but the man who just risked everything for love. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes. The ring slipped onto her finger like it had been waiting for her all along. Mason and Michael whooped with joy, throwing their arms around both adults in a tangle of hugs and happy tears. Scattered applause came from the few remaining passengers, and even the gate agent smiled as she watched the family reunion unfold. Let's go home, Vincent said, standing and gathering his family close. As they walked through the airport, Vincent's phone buzzed with what felt like the 100th call of the evening. This time, he answered. Vincent. Morrison's voice was frantic. Thank God. The board is in emergency session again. They want to discuss your statement. The stock price is. Morrison. Vincent interrupted calmly. Yes. You're fired. Vincent hung up and turned off his phone, slipping his hand into Amara's as Mason and Michael skipped ahead of them toward the exit. No regrets? Amara asked softly. Vincent looked at her, his heart, his future, his family, and smiled with more certainty than he'd felt in years. Only one, he said. What's that? That it took me so long to realize that the most important boardroom decision I'd ever make was walking away from the boardroom entirely. 6 months later, Vincent Ashford stood in the garden behind his house, watching his wife teach their sons to plant roses. The stock price had recovered. The board had reluctantly welcomed him back part-time. The gossip had died down. But none of that mattered as much as the laughter echoing across the lawn, as much as the simple gold band on Amara's finger catching the sunlight, as much as the knowledge that love, real, messy, imperfect, uncompromising love, had finally won. Mason looked up from his rose bush, dirt streaked across his cheek. Amara, is this where we're gonna plant Mama Sarah's jewelry when we dig it up? Right here, sweetheart, Amara said, smoothing his hair. We'll plant it in a special garden just for her, so she can always be part of our family. All of our family, Michael added solemnly. Vincent felt his eyes burn with grateful tears. Because that's what they were now, all of them, past and present, bound together by love that was stronger than grief, trust that had been tested and proven, and the simple truth that sometimes the best things in life are worth every risk you take to keep them. I love you, he called to his family. 3 voices called back in unison, we love you too. And in that moment, Vincent Ashford, former billionaire CEO, current part-time executive, full-time husband and father, knew he was the richest man in the world. What do you think makes love worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible? When you think about the greatest love stories, real or fictional, what makes them truly powerful? Share your thoughts and tell us about a time love conquered fear in your own life. Thank you for joining us on Vincent and Amara's journey from heartbreak to healing, from fear to love, from broken trust to a family reborn. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the quiet moments when we choose love over everything else that seems important. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love, real, transformative, uncompromising love, is always worth the fight. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.